Most Commodore 64s spent their lives in bedrooms, family rooms, and basements. They played games, they taught people their first lines of BASIC, they dialed into bulletin board systems, and occasionally they helped somebody pretend that they were going to balance their checkbook. But one of these apparently went to school. This Commodore 64 carries an asset tag from the Evansville Vanderburgh School Corporation. And after finding both an official 1984 school computer project and a couple of photographs in an old Reitz High School yearbook, we finally have evidence that Commodore 64s really were being used in Evansville schools. Today, we're going to take a look at this pile of 64s that I got here recently, and we're going to examine a very early Revision A motherboard and find out whether this former school computer still works. Welcome back to the studio. I recently picked up 3 different Commodore 64 breadbins as part machines. That means there's no guarantees, they're dirty, they have questionable histories, but one of them contains a very early Revision A motherboard and an EVSC asset tag. Now, before we start borrowing chips from one machine to repair another, I want to see exactly what we have and whether any of them still work. Today, though, we're going to be focusing on that EVSC machine. There's a story behind that school tag, and for once, we have more than just speculation. Before we start taking this apart and testing it, I think it's worth explaining why that tag caught my attention. A Commodore 64 in a school was not unheard of, but it was a little bit unusual. When most people picture an American school computer lab in the early 1980s, they probably picture rows of Apple IIs, and before that it was Commodore PET. Apple had established a strong foothold in education by then. Schools had software, training, dealers, they had institutional support, and it was all built around that Apple platform. The Commodore 64 came from a completely different world. It was inexpensive, it was widely available, and it was enormously popular, but it was usually seen as the computer you brought home. It played games, it connected to the family television, it introduced kids and adults to basic programming. And because Commodore sold so many of them, the software library became enormous. But popularity at home did not automatically make it the obvious choice for a school district. The C64 used the same basic hardware whether it was running a spelling program or blasting aliens. And that was part of its appeal, but it may have also worked against it in education. To many parents and administrators, this looked like a game machine. It used television-style graphics and sound. It had joystick ports built right into the side, and much of the software sold for it sat on store shelves next to arcade games. That was not necessarily the image that a school wanted when asking for money to build a computer program. The Apple II, on the other hand, well, it looked more institutional. The Commodore looked like something a kid had begged for at Christmas. But the C64 also had some very practical advantages. It cost much less than many competing systems. It had strong graphics and sound. It could run word processors, programming languages, art software, typing programs, simulations, and a large range of educational titles. For a school trying to place computers into more classrooms without spending a fortune, the Commodore could make a lot of sense. The problem was deciding which software was genuinely educational and which programs were just ordinary games wearing a necktie. And that is where EVSC's story becomes interesting. Way back in January 1984, Evansville Vanderburgh schools participated in a Lilly Endowment project. It was designed to evaluate educational microcomputer software. EVSC was one of several Indiana school corporations that were involved. Teachers didn't just simply receive a catalog and order whatever had the brightest box. They selected programs, took them back to their schools, used them with students, and then reported what worked and what didn't. EVSC's contact at the time was Media Supervisor Mike Tron, and the local workshop was held on January 28, 1984. Teachers could schedule software for 1 to 3 weeks, have students work through it, and send completed evaluations back through the school system. The surviving report lists more than 20 programs tested in Commodore 64 format. They covered math, reading, spelling, typing, art, word processing, problem solving, and introductory programming. There was Alphabet Zoo for early reading skills. Meteor Multiplication turned arithmetic into a space defense game. Typing Tutor and Word Invaders taught keyboarding. Bank Street Writer introduced students to word processing. KoalaPad Illustrator allowed students to draw on the screen using a touch tablet. That's pretty cool. And Snooper Troops asked students to solve mysteries by taking notes, organizing clues, and working together. This was more than just electronic flashcards. EVSC was trying to find out whether an inexpensive home computer could become a serious classroom tool. What I like most about the project is that teachers were encouraged to challenge the software. They were told to run the programs correctly, then go back and deliberately enter wrong answers and press unexpected keys and see how the program handled the mistakes. Basically, they were told to go and use the computer like a student. And the results, well, they were mixed. Some programs were praised for motivating students and make them want to keep learning and even take the games home. Others were criticized for being confusing or inaccurate or had weak feedback or really slow loading or simply just being boring. Now, one program was even criticized because the animation for a wrong answer was more entertaining than the reward for getting it right. That is not ideal for educational design, but it is extremely on brand for the Commodore 64. Across the participating school corporations, the first year involved 1,197 students and 162 teachers. The average program rating landed in the mid-70s, so it wasn't just a rubber stamp exercise. Some software earned a place in the classroom, and some apparently deserved to be placed back in the envelope and returned immediately. Then I found this photograph in the 1985 Reitz High School yearbook. It appears on the table of contents page beside the student life section. Now you can clearly see that it's a Commodore 64. And take a look at this picture. This is a computer lab that looks like it's full of old Commodore 64 bread bins. Now that gives us visual evidence that a machine just like this one was present inside an EVSC high school during that same period that the district was evaluating the Commodore software. Now, I can't prove that this machine is the same one that's in the photograph. I can't even prove this particular asset tag C64 came from Reitz. It may have been used in another school or in the library, a media center, computer lab, or central instructional department, and it may have been moved between buildings during its working life. But now we know the asset tag is not an isolated curiosity. The district had Commodore software. A Reitz yearbook shows what appears to be a Commodore 64 in use. And sitting on this bench is an early C64 that still carries that EVSC property tag. That gives us a real story without pretending we know every missing detail. So to me, this machine represents something a little different from the typical Commodore story. It was school property. Somebody at the EVSC believed the Commodore 64 might have a place in education. Now my question is if this one actually survived its time in the classroom. Let's open it up and see what actually I brought home. Now one of the first things that I immediately noticed about this, besides the fact that it's missing its case screws, is that it has a little bit different case design than the others that I'm used to. The other 64 bread bins I'm used to have a long kind of a clip on them. This one is more of just a little hook that catches the back of the case. And I even verified with some of the other cases that the tops and bottoms will not connect together on the different style case. So, this is an early bread bin example. But if we look inside of it, we'll just take a look and see if there's anything that looks like it's out of place or burned or, just generally in bad shape. All of the chips look pretty good. These Revision A motherboards have a few more discrete components on them than the later revisions because Commodore, after some time in their other revisions, consolidated stuff down a little bit better. But this one looks like it's got the 6581, 6510, everything. We've got a couple of socketed chips in here, which is nice, but so yeah, the 6510, the 6581, the ROM, those are all socketed. The rest of them look like they're just soldered right into the board, so hopefully we don't have to replace any of those. One of the big failure points on these sometimes is some of the capacitors, the power switch, so we'll have to check this out. Now, one thing I will say is never trust the old Commodore 64 power supplies. And I think I mention this in every video that we do about a Commodore 64 because these over time will start outputting voltage that is way off the charts high and you'll just immediately fry your computer. So do not use one of these. When I test these older bread bins unless I know I have a good power supply. I use an aftermarket model that I know is outputting the proper voltage. So looking at it, you know, a little bit of corrosion on the side, nothing too terrible. So I think we're going to go ahead and try to power this up and see if this one actually works. Now before we fire this up, it also has the earlier 5-pin video output on it before Commodore went to, I believe it was an 8-pin. I'm using my aftermarket power supply just to make sure I don't fry it with bad power. So fusing it is good. All right, so this is the first power up of this unit. I have not powered this up before, so we'll try this one out together and see what happens. Does not appear anything is happening. Now I have seen it occasionally happen with these where it may take a few minutes for it to initially turn on. But it could also just be dead. One thing I do want to check is we can plug in the case or the LED from the case and see if we have any if we have a power LED. And we do not. So that's telling me that we at least do not have power going that far with it. All right, so now looks like we will start our testing procedure to see if we can figure out why we do not have any video output on this. All right, so I've been doing a little bit of probing around this thing, and we've got voltage coming into the unit. I can probe that. I've got the 5 volts coming in. Everything seems okay there. I even probed the voltage regulator, and we're getting about 11 volts on one side, and we're getting our 5 volts on the other, which is correct. I did notice this chip getting pretty hot when we're fired up, which leads me to believe that there's a short or something in the unit. Now, I've also checked these chips. They seem to be okay. I've pulled the SID chip out. No boot with that either. So I actually ended up looking at the 6510 chip. And what's interesting about that is if we probe this one, pin 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, is the 5 volt, goes to the 5 volt rail, which, 4.8 volts, that's about right. Well, pin 1 and pin 21 are also a ground. But if I go to pin 1 on that chip, I'm only getting 2.6 volts. So if we turn this off and we go to diode, we should be able to get on pin 21 continuity and on pin 1 continuity. But we're not getting any continuity on pin 1. So that leads me to believe that there's a broken trace or a bad solder joint or something going on with this 6510 and where it's actually hooked into the board. So we've got power off to that, and I think we need to go ahead and pull this board out of here so that we can flip it over and take a look. We should be able to trace that trace, for lack of a better word, and see if we can find where that crack is. Hopefully it's just a bad joint in the socket, but we will find out, because that could be backing the voltage up enough so that the processor won't go into boot. So that'll be the first thing we'll check, since all the other normal checks seem to check out. I checked all the voltages on the RAM chips in their different positions. Those are all fine. So to me, that says that it's got to be that, narrowed down to that 6510. So that should let us pull our board out. We'll flip that over. All right, well, I am not seeing a broken trace here. And I am still not getting continuity on the bottom. I am on the other ground line, but not on that one. Well, after a little bit more poking, I was able to get it to boot up and give me an out-of-memory error at 0 with a little @ symbol before the error and no flashing cursor, no cursor at all. So it's almost pointing to a bad RAM chip, maybe in U21. So I'm going to see if I can dig up some RAM chips and maybe some other replacement parts and see if we can get this thing going again. But, this is a project that, is going to be ongoing. This was more about the history of this machine. And I think we really do need to, restore it for its former glory, bring this back as a school machine running school software. So if you attended or worked for EVSC during the 1980s and remember these Commodore computers, I'd love to hear from you. Which school were you at? Who had them? What programs did you use? And do you recognize that asset tag? Sometimes a parts machine is just a source of chips and plastic, but sometimes it turns out to be a piece of local history. That's what this is. So I would love to get this working and put, back into use somewhere. Maybe EVSC wants it for their museum or something. But anyway, that's all I've got today. We'll do another episode digging further into this because we've gone long enough already. But I want to thank you all for watching and happy vintage computing.